Greetings everyone, this is Ehav, and this is part 2 of Jewish migrations into West Africa. So in this particular video, I'm going to cover the second half of the topic concerning Jewish migrations into West Africa. In order to understand this one, if you haven't seen the first two videos I did, that's episode 18 and episode 19, both of those videos are very important to understand what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So I would suggest that you watch those two videos first. So this video is going to be, I guess like you could say the ending video at least, concerning this particular topic. In this area, I'm going to be discussing some of the later migrations that took place into West Africa, covering somewhere between about the 13th century up until maybe around like the 1700s or so. So that's going to be this particular video. So when starting this particular topic, it's going to come from a different angle than the first topic. So that's why I think it's best to start in Cape Verde. Cape Verde are a group of islands that are off the coast of Senegal and also Gambia in West Africa. Supposedly, according to the Portuguese, when they, if you will, discovered these islands, they were uninhabited at the time. So in the 1400s, they had started a colony in the region in order to help supplement the trade that they were doing, in West Africa to other regions. Part of this trade that they were doing, was specifically in the slave trade and also in terms of whaling. Now, what is important about this area is around the time that they started to really colonize this region, this is also around the time that they had started to persecute Jews that were living in Portugal, as well as Jews who were in Spain, were starting to face what was called the Inquisition. So there were a number of Jews who, in some cases, got to this area and escaped to this area to try to get away from the Inquisition. In other situations, the Jews who were in this region were made up of former Jews, Jews who were called New Christians or Moranos, who were forced to convert to Christianity during the Inquisition. And in some cases, getting to these areas allowed them to either partially or wholeheartedly return to Judaism. So what's known about the Jewish community in this particular region is that there were a number of correspondences that were going on back and forth between Cape Verde and also Portugal. Some of these correspondence concerned the new Christians, supposedly, who were there, who were no longer living by Christianity, at least not 100%. Some of them, according to these correspondences, had already returned to living as Jews because they were away from the watchful eye of the Inquisition, if you will. So this is, something that's interesting concerning this community, that they got to a region that they could feel safe, in terms of living, and, basically they returned in some cases to their Jewish roots. Now, one of the reasons that they were placed there was to kind of serve as middlemen, which also led to the next group of Jews who came, and that was a group of Moroccan Jews who were merchants who came to Cape Verde in the later years. And more information is known about this group of Jews who actually married local women, local Catholic women, or in some cases just simply, had, sexual relations with them and produced children from them, which basically there are a number of people in Cape Verde who are descendants of this mix. When I first did this presentation at the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in New York, there were a number of, there was a friend of mine who was a Moroccan Jew who brought some relatives of his who were from Cape Verde, and they, were descendants of this mix that took place. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a topic that's close to home for me, as well as, in the first video, some things in there that were close to home for me. This is concerning the Jews who were called crypto-Jews, or, if you will, New Christians, who were Jews who had been either forced or who had accepted a forced conversion into Christianity because of the Inquisition. A number of these people had actually moved from Europe into West Africa and were, involved either in trade as merchants, because in some cases, them being Jewish helped out in terms of being middlemen, because as Jews, they weren't really a threat to any of the populations that they were a part of. So basically, this group of people were made up of people in some cases who either returned to Judaism once they got to West Africa, once they got to Senegal, or Senegambia, as it's called sometimes, because of the connection between Senegal and Gambia. And in many cases, some of them were either between being Jewish or being Christian, but there was always a connection to them being Jewish. So one of the things that's interesting about this particular community is in some cases you hear about Jews, being in regions and local people converting to Judaism, which, happened in this case. You had some Jews who had servants or had slaves that they converted to Judaism. You had some Jews who married people who converted to Judaism. But in this, case, in this location, you also had Jews who accepted the local religions in some cases and married into the local communities. There's even stories of even, non-Jews, who were Christians who married into some of the royal families in West Africa in order to kind of, I guess, not as much gain power, but also to kind of, form, coalitions with the local people. Concerning this community, what's also interesting is that most of the maps that we have of West Africa that are, from a European origin, not, saying that, West African origin, but from a European origin, actually were drawn up by Jews. One of the first maps that Europeans had of West Africa was drawn by a Jew by the name of Abraham Crescus, and this is around the 13th century or so. There was also a number of histories that say that Jews, even in Arabia, knew about West Africa. This during the time when the Mali king Mansa Musa had traveled into Arabia, and Jewish merchants already knew who he was. So what's interesting about this topic also in this regard, former president of Senegal, Leopold Senghor, once told Shimon Peres that he had Jewish ancestry. So this, of course, could have been, the result of what we would have called descendants of both a mix between the Jews of the Mediterranean, Spanish Jews, Portuguese Jews who were in Senegal, as well as various West African ethnic groups, which, would have produced, some people use the word mulatto Jews. We even have records in the Jewish community in Holland, that basically there were a number of Jews there who were of mixed descent or of African descent, and some of them were even buried in the Jewish cemetery there and had full rights because they were, of course, of Jewish ancestry being mixed. So this provides with an interesting view. Okay, so now we're looking at a recap of, what I've talked about in both of these videos in terms of the locations or the locales that we have known documented records of there being Jews, of mixed descent as well as Jews of, descent from various parts of the world. So of course, going back to the previous question, what happened to them? Many of them, of course, left because of trade conditions. Some of them rejoined Jewish communities who were, still existent to this day. Some of them, assimilated into the local non-Jewish populations, and some of their descendants still have these stories that their ancestors were Jews. And some of them, were basically killed off during the different invasions that took place from North Africa, as well as from just different situations that were happening. So as far as the rest, only God knows. So when I first did this presentation, I think it was around 2007, maybe 2006, 2007. A friend of mine once asked me, he's like a real skeptic of all these kind of things. He first asked, like, okay, well, all right, so what? You proved it. So why does this matter? Why is it even important? If you look, I have a list of reasons that I kind of consider it important, outside of the bigger reason that I consider important. The main reason I consider this kind of information to be important is because it happened. Because of the fact that it happened, people like me exist. This is the whole reason, part of the reason I exist, because of this mix, because I'm a descendant of it. The other reason it's important is because all history is important. There are so many untold stories out there that help us define who we are, not just within the Jewish sense, but also just as people in general. I'm a firm believer that everybody has a story, and everybody's story should be a part of the fabric of who we are, and it should be known. So that's one of the reasons that I've been kind of big on talking about it, and I'm kind of glad to see that there are things out there that are starting to promote this idea that these things, this history, a lot more. So with that, it's kind of like if the question now begins: is this really the end of the story, or is this just the beginning? Is this the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information on this topic? So once again, I want to present the sources that are used for this, and this is only a small smidge of sources, if you will. This is not everything that's out there, because in some cases, some of the documents that I, have had access to concerning this stuff is really hard to come by. So these are some of the things that you can look into yourself to kind of get an idea, about more on this topic. Now it must be remembered, even with these sources, that some people think that in some cases there's some magic bullet out there that about Judaism in terms of West African Jews that makes them so distinct and so different from everyone else, but that's not the case. Concerning the information that's out there, basically the Jews in West Africa were made up of Israelis, as well as Jews who transversed to many different locations and ended up in West Africa and married within the local populations, and that's the history. So once again, this is Ehav from the Chronicles of Ehav. Thanking you very much for taking part in this presentation. And if you have any questions about it, let me know.